Tales from the Far Territory Part 6 drops in 2 months, possibly sooner, bringing with it the revised Cougar, global wildlife refresh, custom safe houses, and more. The October Dev Diary for the Long Dark is out, and it is long and it is beefy, so hello Legion, this is Hadrian. Thank you for being here. Let's go through the coming updates to Hinterland Studios' The Long Dark. This is a proper Dev Diary overview, so we're going to go through it together section by section, but I'm also going to summarize and distill for you so that you can have this on in the background and track the basics without having to go through it line by line yourself. At a few key points, I will be jumping in with some important context and impressions. To that end, full disclosure, I will not be keeping my bias out of this summary. I am, after all, more excited about some announcements than others, and I want this to be a video for my viewers as much as I want it to be a video for the Hinterland community at large. I have strong feelings about some of the content in the back half of the Dev Diary, so I'm going to be sharing some thoughts there, and indeed this video has taken longer to get to you because I've been finding the words to say what I'd really like to say. Raphael begins the diary with a note that the diary is both an update on the Long Dark as well as an answer to frequently asked questions about the current status of the game and the studio. As for Wintermute Episode 5 and Tales from the Far Territory Part 6, Episode 5 will now be out as soon as possible next year. Part 6 of the Tales DLC is due to release in December, concluding the suite of additions to the Long Dark made by the DLC, and after Tales is complete, all hands will be on deck for the Long Dark's long-awaited final chapter, which, again, will be as soon as possible in 2025. As far as this news is concerned, as far as Episode 5 goes, while this is not what was originally announced, not a definitive launch date, and not even a definitive launch window, which is sure to frustrate some of the game's longtime backers, understandably. Ultimately, this is a respectable decision on the part of Raphael and team. The initial implementation of the Cougar was received more poorly than probably any major change Hinterland has ever made to the game, and I do not think that is a controversial statement. It was pretty bad. Hinterland appear to have taken community feedback deeply into consideration, which we'll get to in a moment, but that comes at a cost. And that cost appears to be the team meeting the original launch window for Episode 5. Raphael acknowledges that this creates additional pressure and scrutiny on the team. As players, it's helpful for us to bear in mind that there is a strong positive correlation between pressure and scrutiny and the time it takes to get a beloved game like The Long Dark right. As one increases, so does the other, if expectations are to truly be met. And Hinterland is trying to meet them, which is something I deeply respect and appreciate. After all, it probably affects their bottom line quite a lot to have to spend more time on The Long Dark than they planned, especially as an independent self-publishing development studio. The fact that Raphael and his team are willing to eat the monetary cost of delivering the best possible experience to us as players means a lot to me. So, Episode 5 will take us to Perseverance Mills. We'll finally get to crack open Astrid's hard case, find out the truth behind the Auroras, and at last see a showdown between Will Mackenzie and Mathis. You will play as both Astrid Greenwood and Will Mackenzie in Episode 5, and Episode 5 will be the biggest update to, or the biggest episode to date. It'll be the final chapter in the story as well, for those of you who didn't know that. It'll set up future stories in more games, film, television, and beyond, which is a pretty cool little teaser if you ask me. So, moving on to what for sandbox players is probably the first thing in the Dev Diary that we were really looking to hear about and get confirmation on. The revised Cougar is now fully part of Tales Part 6, and thus the new version of what we first saw in Part 5 will be released along with the final installment of Tales rather than as a separate update or hotfix. In brief, the Cougar will now be a, quote, more active presence in the world, in accordance with the community's feedback on the initial rollout. The most important difference is that, like any other predator in the Long Dark, it can now be encountered in the game world at random, which means it can now also be avoided, and perhaps more than any other predator, it may keep its distance when the player pays attention and heeds its warnings. So the major reimagining that seems to have occurred here is around territoriality. The first version of the Cougar was fairly gimmicky and not unlike the Dark Walker in that it became more and more of a threat the longer the player remained in any one zone. This was meant to convey territoriality, but in hindsight, it felt much more aggressive, as the player might have ended up feeling stalked all over the entire map by one cat. The new Cougar, by virtue of being an in-game presence that can be avoided, rather than a pop-up attack that can't be avoided, will actually behave in a territorial manner by remaining out of sight, but by dropping subtle hints in the game world, and maybe not so subtle if you get too close, that it's nearby, and generally would like you to leave it alone. So again, this is not going to be a UI-based experience anymore, which the first Cougar, for the most part, was. This is actually going to be a in-game predator like any other, as we were kind of initially thinking it would be. The original version of the Cougar was always expected to be that, and then when Hinterland announced that it was more of a mechanic than an actual wildlife presence, I think ultimately that distinction, that decision, was what backfired, and Hinterland has now corrected this. Well, I guess we'll find out to what extent they've corrected it. But one thing that I am really paying attention to, because if it's not clear, I'm optimistic that this implementation of the Cougar will deliver on what the first version did not. This sounds like exactly what we've always hoped for, and all that remains to be seen is just how polished the team was able to get it, given everything else they already have on their plate, which we have already and will continue to talk about in this video. So if it's very polished and feels great, I'm going to be giving them an ovation because they'd have earned one. So moving on to some news for the Nintendo Switch. There's no easy way to say this. The Long Dark in its current version might be too much game for the Switch. Raphael apologetically writes that the team has been struggling with various memory-related and stability problems since Tales Part 4, and the problem does not appear to have a clear resolution. Consequently, while a major update is being worked on to address the issues, Parts 5 and 6 of Tales, including the Cougar, will not be arriving on the Nintendo Switch until next year. Which is bad news for the more Switch-dependent citizens of the Quiet Apocalypse for sure. Raphael hopes to share an updated timeline for Parts 5 and 6 once the crashes are resolved. In particular, he still hopes to release a hotfix for the crashes themselves this year. It's important to note that as of this video's publication, the dev diary makes no mention of Episode 5's Switch release, but it's possible this may be delayed as well. This appears to be quite an unexpected development, and it sounds as though the team is trying hard to work around some difficult realizations around the upper limits of the Switch's capabilities. In the dev diary, Raphael offers a clear apology to Switch users for what sounds like a massive headache for developers and players alike. It's hard for me to know how foreseeable something like this was. On the one hand, it's surprising to hear that The Long Dark was released on a platform that seems not to meet specifications. On the other hand, the game has vastly outgrown its initial vision in so many ways, and it's easy to imagine that certain decisions regarding a Switch release may well have been set in motion before or even long before some of the more recent expansions to the world. Moving on to Tales Part 6. What's most interesting about this update's feature set is how cryptically it's described. Here's what we're going to get in the final update to Tales from the Far Territory. First of all, Cougar 2.0, which you can disable if you don't want to deal with extra spicy wildlife. The Trader, which provides access to a variety of useful items, including some exclusive to the Trader. The best items that the Trader has will require the player to mull what Raphael calls questionable demands, quote unquote. Players who don't want the Trader in the sandbox will be able to disable it, just like you can disable the Cougar. The dev diary doesn't mention, though, how the player will actually come into contact with the Trader. It's unclear whether we will be able to summon them, either from certain points or from anywhere on the map, randomly appear nearby. Maybe the Trader will just randomly show up and walk up on us in a Cougar 1.0-like pop-up event, or whether they will in fact summon the player by sending a notification of their presence in a nearby area and providing a window in which we can meet them before they move on, which would make the most sense to me because it would create a challenge to get to them in time while braving the harsh conditions of the world. That's a lot of conjecture on my part, for sure, but again, the dev diary doesn't give us much here, so we'll just have to see. And those would be my guesses just off the cuff with regard to what we might be seeing. Next, safe house customization. Any interior space in the game for which the player passes through a loading screen while entering is game for safe house customization. Just look at these screenshots of Trapper's Cabin. Any of these spaces, again, if you can enter it with a loading screen, this system applies. Any of these spaces can be cleaned up and redecorated using a variety of new furniture and props, and there are some safe house-centric gameplay tools included as well. Again, what does that mean? Safe house-centric gameplay tools? We don't know. We literally don't know. It's one big tease, and one that Raphael is clearly having some eye-twinkling fun with. I expect at least one smaller scale, but pleasant surprise here. I don't have any information on how many people requested the safe house customization, by the way, but what I will tell you is that this is one of the things I personally asked for in qualitative feedback when responding to Hinterland's community survey, the answers to which, as we all remember, went on to become the basis for Tales from the Far Territory. So they sent out a survey to all players saying, hey, give us some feedback on what you would like to see in terms of future additions and DLC. If we did DLC, what would you be most willing to support, etc., etc. And they just asked for suggestions on features that we would be most excited about. And safe house customization is more or less something that I suggested at that point. So it's really exciting and nice to see this. Another thing that's being added, which we were sitting on for a moment already on the screen, is the instant camera. You can now find what the Dev Diary calls an old manual instant camera, quote unquote, along with color, black and white, or sepia film stock to use for your photographs. Using your choice of these film types, you can now take your own pictures in the world, add them to an album, and then bring them directly into the Quiet Apocalypse by using them as decorations in your safe houses. I can't say much more than the Dev Diary on this change, other than it sounds like a nice touch, and even a bit of a love letter to the game's community. The Long Dark's always had a beautiful, unique-looking world, and it's the look of the game that's made it such a timeless classic for so many gamers and creators over the last decade. The addition of the camera seems to give us a new way to immerse ourselves in the experience of this beautiful world, and I'm all for it. Next, we have the Global Wildlife Refresh. Every wildlife spawn in the entire game has been redone. Predators and prey. This is the one many of us have been most excited about. The loot table refresh that came out last year was a welcome mix-up for established players, and now every single living creature in the world will now patrol different paths. This means, in essence, that everything old will feel at least somewhat new again. When you stop to think about it, only about 1/3 of the thrill of exploration in the Long Dark is what we call map knowledge. The next third is what you're able to scavenge and where you can find things. And the final third is where the wildlife threats are. And now, just like the loot tables were refreshed last year, all of that is about to be reset, which means that even the most hardened veteran survivors among us can finally expect the unexpected again, which is pretty exciting stuff. Speaking of exciting stuff, visual enhancements. A suite of visual enhancements will release in the spring of next year and will be free for all players. The Dev Diary initially says these enhancements are part of Tales, but if you see anyone who thinks they're exclusive to people who buy the DLC, that you have to pay for the visual enhancements, make sure to tell them this is not the case. As you can see here, these will be available for free to everyone who owns the Long Dark. I've been looking forward to this as well. The visual enhancements. As timeless as the Long Dark's art style is, it will be good to see some more modern visual effects. Speaking of heading off potential confusion, this doesn't mean the Long Dark's overall graphical style will be changing. For anyone who sees this and thinks, oh, they're going to update it to make it look different somehow. That's not what the team is doing here. Think of these updates as flourishes or garnishes that highlight and complement the existing style, which we have. All evidence points to the fact that Hinterland loves the way that their game looks, and they don't want to change it. So think of it as a fresh new haircut from a fancy barber, but keeping your existing hairstyle rather than changing styles. That's really what this is about. So nobody panic. The game's most significant graphical overhauls are pretty permanently behind us. So now what? The Long Dark, good news, will still be supported with new content expanding on the trader and safe house systems through 2025 and into 2026. But the level of support for the trader and safe house will be determined by community interest. What else? What else indeed? A completely overhauled custom settings system, exposing as many tunables as we can beyond the current offering, Raphael says, so that you can customize your TLD experience along very specific lines of gameplay settings and whatnot. quote unquote. This, Raphael says, should be a very powerful set of tools for fine-tuning the TLD experience to your liking. I cannot put into words how exciting this is. And this is one part of my script for this dev diary overview that I have just like left blank because I was just going to go off here. And I was like, there's no way that I can like really write down, that I can capture my excitement in words here. So let me just say off the cuff, all of my Long Dark gameplay since launch, well, with the exception of the challenges that we ran last year, has been in custom modes. I love customizing the gameplay of the Long Dark. Not only do I love it, you love it. There are lots of players, including the most hardened survivors out there, who really enjoy pushing the difficulty of the Long Dark, no matter how gamey it gets, to the absolute max. I'm not necessarily in that crowd. I like to kind of combine challenge with a sense of like immersion and still have like the opportunity for relaxation from time to time. So it's a tough balance to maintain, especially as a content creator where people want to see challenge. But at the same time, there are a ton of content creators and a ton of just players who love to play the game at a really high difficulty. And this will give us more flexibility in creating the ideal gaming environment in the Quiet Apocalypse. And one of the things that I'm most excited about personally, and I imagine that this will be added, there's no confirmation, but I have wanted for a long time, if you want an example of how they might expand this, again, this is my conjecture, there's no confirmation in the dev diary that this is going to happen, but I have wanted for a long time for tools like the knife and the hatchet to still be discoverable when you have an interloper level loot table. The way that the custom settings currently work, if you want an interloper difficulty loot table with like very scarce resources, you have to also eat the discoverable, or the discoverability, shall we say, of the knife and the hatchet. Because in order to run the interloper loot table, you also basically have to accept your handcrafting, your tools. That has always been a little bit annoying to me. I like the idea of just being able to find those tools, maybe make them a little bit more scarce, but let me at least find them. And that is one thing that might soon be possible with these changes. Now, again, this is not going to be until 2025 or 2026, but these updates are probably coming sooner rather than later, especially once episode 5 is done. So after episode 5 drops, we can really start salivating for some of these polish updates, because the hard work on the Long Dark at that point will be done. And it'll just be a matter of like putting the cherry on top of this beautiful game that we've all loved for so long. So on top of that, we also have proper mod support, which was previously promised, and we've been moving towards that for years. I mean, I'm excited about that too, because I would like the Long Dark to have like a nicer night sky, and some mods have attempted that over the years. As far as I know, they're not currently working, but stuff like that is something I'd be interested in, as long as I felt like it had the blessing of the studio and was really designed to work with the game and didn't hurt it in any way, which really sounds like is what they're angling for. So that's very exciting as well. And it's also worth acknowledging that that's something that Raphael has come around on. For a long time, he has resisted this because of just the kind of creative that he is. He has a particular vision for what he wants his game to be, and he didn't want it to be diluted by modding to an extent. And I am just kind of stating that as a reflection on his previous stance. He has sort of opened up to the possibility of having the game modded, which I think is a good decision. So I'm really excited to see these possibilities added, because ultimately we all have control over what we mod and what we don't. So as long as we want to respect the vision of the game as he sort of laid it out, we can do so. But if we also want to mess with it, play with it like it's our own toy, we will now be able to do that, which is pretty freaking cool. And I'm grateful to him for kind of thinking about that and making that change. The Long Dark's previously announced film adaptation is still underway, with more news hopefully in 2025. Look for an announcement regarding the return of the Hinterland store as well in the back half of November. So those are the kind of footnotes of the dev diary, but it's not the last thing that Raphael really goes into detail on. Well, actually, it's the film and the store are the last things that he goes into detail on. But look at this. Look at this big old chunk of text. Look at the rest of the dev diary. And then look at this chunk of text after new games in the future. So, current development plan, just to kind of wrap up everything that we've talked about before we get into this, seems to be that the Episode 5 team and the Tales 6 team are working concurrently, which is to say, some of Hinterland's team is working on Episode 5, and some of Hinterland's team is working on Tales 6 right now, with Tales 6 releasing this December, and Episode 5 of the story mode releasing as soon as possible in 2025. So after Part 6, every single member of the team will be brought to Great Bear perhaps, for the home stretch of the story mode's development. After that, Hinterland will be free to maintain support for the Long Dark on the one hand, which sounds like at least another few years of updates and final polish after Episode 5 is finished. And on the other hand, they'll be able to pivot to their next titles, which the Dev Diary does talk about with surprising depth and candor, but not for the reasons you might think. So this is where I veer more heavily into my personal bias. Let me read one particular snippet verbatim. As an independent, self-funded developer, Hinterland doesn't have the luxury of having multiple years of, quote, downtime, end quote, between our games to build up our next things and launch them. We don't have an external publisher paying our bills while we build new things. We are our own publisher, so we have to pay our own bills. This also means that we own our own revenue, rather than having to split it with a publisher, and this means we can invest our own revenue into taking care of our people, running our company ethically, and making the kinds of games we want to make. So let's break down what this means. Most games have both a publisher and a developer attached to them. The developers are the people making the game: programmers, artists, writers, and testers. The publishers are the organizations responsible for marketing, releasing, and ensuring distribution, digital or otherwise, for the game. This is why, typically, we have different groups of people doing these very different things. But importantly, it's the publishers who bankroll and impose limitations upon the development team. So if you have a publisher, you have cash support, but you can have deadlines and other changes literally forced upon you by people who are not programmers or developers, by people who don't understand the challenges of the actual work, which can create problems. Hinterland is self-funded. Hinterland is both developer and publisher. They are in control of all their money. So basically, they do what they want, and they can shift priorities to meet the demands of their art, as we've seen since the Long Dark first arrived in early access. But they pay a price for their freedom. They have to work a lot harder to make ends meet, because this one relatively small company has to work and pay for every single hour that goes into both the development and the publishing of its titles. This is largely why the story mode has taken so long to release, but it's also why Hinterland is free to address community concerns like the revisions to the Cougar, for example, and to experiment based on extensive community feedback they collected in advance with novel DLC strategies like Tales from the Far Territory. To this end, the point that Raphael goes on to make as he concludes the October Dev Diary here is that Hinterland is going to be talking about their next games very soon. He's doing this, one, because it's time for them to do so, and two, because they literally can't put it off. They can't put it off because keeping Hinterland afloat as an independent studio, including during the final years of the Long Dark's active development, requires that they start to hype up new projects while our favorite Quiet Apocalypse simulator is still heading for the sunset. A lot of what I've just shared, to be clear, is just objective summary reflection and restatement of what's in the diary, with a bit of explanation thrown in for clarity, I suppose. As for my take, it's frustrating to see so much time spent justifying what the team is working on and how they're working on it. It shouldn't have felt necessary, but I, for one, understand why it did feel necessary. To put it simply, Raphael clearly feels he can't talk openly about his studio's next big moves without a whole lot of what I would personally consider to be avoidable backlash. You can always feel Raphael's passion in everything he writes. You can also, if you choose to, feel his pain, in part because pain and passion are often indistinguishable. Raphael writes with his heart on his sleeve. What you see is what you get. He He's not perfect, he's made his share of mistakes, and he's thus not popular with everyone who plays his game. But as far as I'm concerned, we should all be so lucky as to have such passion at the helm of our favorite games, even if that eccentricity leads to a debacle or two over the years. While I understand there are those who feel differently, I have a hard time empathizing with, and I honestly draw a hard line against, those who insult, defame, and outright abuse Raphael, abuse Hinterland, and abuse other game developers as people. As people. Because they're dissatisfied with a transaction. And to be clear, I'm convinced it is the constancy of this kind of abuse from certain corners of the player base, certain corners, that drove Raphael to go on at such length about Hinterland's next moves. Again, we're fully into my reaction here, not Raphael's words. I'm interpreting, and I could be wrong. But isn't it frustrating that Raphael felt it so necessary to essentially say, please give us a chance. Please let us tell you what we're doing next without punishing us. And please don't get mad at us for conducting our business in a way that we can continue to put food on our own tables and continue to make great games for you at the same time. Isn't it frustrating that this section of the dev diary is the longest? These are the words of a guy and a team under immense pressure to maintain independence as artists in a world that is making it increasingly frustrating to have the kind of independence Hinterland has. The overall quality of the game we've now enjoyed for a decade is a direct consequence of their independence. And in the name of maintaining that independence, and by extension, protecting the quality of their creative output, Raphael asks, pleads even, for our ongoing patience, understanding, and support. And I'm going to give it to him. If you're a subscriber to this channel, new or old, let me encourage you to give it to him too. If you're listening to this video and you disagree with my take, or you disagree with something that Raphael has said, or something that Hinterland has done as a company, that's okay, but my respect for your disagreement ends the moment you make the lives of this team unnecessarily harder. If you don't like what an artist creates, there's one way to effectively change that. Stop giving them money and find entertainment literally anywhere else. When you continue to invest time and money into something you actively dislike, and then you post about your displeasure every time they inevitably disappoint you, you're choosing to poison the well for everyone who wants to be here for the next exciting chapter of this creative vision's history, of Hinterland's history. And I want to be here for it. I'm here for it. And I hope you are too. If the final portions of the dev diary tell us anything, it's that Hinterland's success is just as much up to us as it is up to them. We, as a community, can help Raphael make that chapter awesome, or we can hinder him. So let's help him. In brief, to summarize the content of this dev diary, Tales Part 6 in December, Episode 5 as soon as possible next year. Cougar 2.0 is part of Tales Part 6. The Cougar is purportedly more in line with original expectations than Cougar 1.0. Nintendo Switch. Hinterland is extremely unhappy to have to say this, but Tales 5 and 6 are not coming until next year. Memory and overhead work continues on the Nintendo Switch in response to stability issues. Possible hotfix by December. Tales 6 details seem intentionally vague, so we'll see how that goes. Part 6 will include the Cougar, Trader, custom safe houses, the instant camera, and the much-anticipated wildlife refresh. Spring 2025 will bring a visual enhancements update to Sandbox and Story Mode for top-end PC and console users. Hinterland plans to support Long Dark with smaller free updates and polish patches into 2025 and 2026. These patches will include hotfixes and additional content for features included in Tales Part 6, and they will also include mod support and overhauled custom settings. Hinterland will soon be revealing more information on the status of the Long Dark film adaptation, and Hinterland will soon be revealing more information on the status of their next games. That is the long and short of the October Dev Diary. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to follow along. For early episodes, channel emotes, and member badges, look for the join button. New Long Dark episodes drop at 1 p.m. US Eastern Time every other day, and comments are always welcome, so leave your thoughts below. And I'll see you next time.